Okay, there have been a lot of different film versions of Superman over the years, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit today. I'm going to compare my favorite aspects of them from the classic Superman films of Christopher Reeve through the Lois and Clark television show, through the Smallville television show, and the most recent Man of Steel movie. We're going to start on Krypton, and I'm just going to give my favorite versions and maybe a discussion of who I thought was memorable. Um, we're going to start with Krypton, and my favorite version of Krypton has to be the version from Man of Steel. It's the most vibrant version of Krypton. It's the version of Krypton where we actually get to see what life is like on Krypton, what the planet was like. We see some of the life forms that they actually use as transportation, a little bit of Kryptonian society, and the runner up would have to be the version of Krypton that we see in the Richard Donner films with Christopher Reeve. Now, that version, we don't see too much of it, but it's very wide. Some people described it as looking like an ice planet. I thought it actually looked like it was meant to be somewhat heavenly, with the Kryptonians walking around in robes, looking like they might perhaps represent angels of some kind. Um, Nowhere near as vibrant, nowhere near as immediate, but given the way Krypton has or hasn't been depicted in most of the other versions, for example, in Lois and Clark and in Smallville, you never really see Krypton itself. Maybe a little bit in Smallville, but not enough for it to register. So my favorite version of Krypton is the one from the Man of Steel. Next, we move on to Jor-El himself. The best version of Jor-El that I have seen, in my opinion, has to be the version of Jor-El played by Russell Crowe in Man of Steel. This is the version that gets out there. He kicks a little ass. He's a scientist, but he knows how to fight. And you follow him around for a significant portion of the film. He's the best version of Jor-El that I've seen. Now, the most iconic version of Jor-El is, of course, Marlon Brando in the Richard Donner films. He's much less active. He doesn't do much. He's there mostly for exposition, but it's his standing there giving exposition is literally as iconic as the opening, uh, the opening of Star Wars, where you have letters scrolling across the screen. If letters scrolling across the screen was ever iconic, it's there. And that's kind of the same way that Marlon Brando's version of Jor-El is iconic. Now you move on to Smallville. In Smallville, you have the computerized uh, download of Jor-El's mind, which is played by Terrence Stamp, the same Terrence Stamp, incidentally, who plays General Zod in the Richard Donner films. And he's he's good at it. He will remind you of Marlon Brando. I do believe he's patterned after Marlon Brando, although a much more Machiavellian version of Marlon Brando. In Smallville, he's originally not a good guy. He's one of the villains almost. He does come around by the end of Smallville, but he's not your hero. And whenever Jor-El has to show up in person in Smallville, he's played by Julian Sands. Julian Sands does a good job, but neither of those two, Julian Sands or Terrence Stamp, is ever going to be as iconic as either Marlon Brando or Russell Crowe. So that's Jor-El. Now you move on to Lara L, Jor-El's wife. For me, the two best versions of Lara L are the version from Smallville, who's actually played by, I believe it's Helen Slater, incidentally, the woman who played Supergirl in the Supergirl film that was paired with the Christopher Reeve Superman films. And the Lara L from Man of Steel, who's played by, I believe her name is pronounced Ayelet Zura. She has much less screen time than Helen Slater's version. Helen Slater's version, however, is she doesn't again she doesn't do much. She's there. She's sort of involved in a love triangle between General Zod and Jor-El. Um, the Man of Steel version of Laura L. I felt seemed to be a stronger character. Um, but the character was never really that major. Um, I have to go with Islet Zura and Man of Steel. So now we get to the big guy. We get to General Zod. So the three General Zods that matter, because there's no General Zod on Lois and Clark. Um, on Smallville, General Zod is played by an actor named Callum Blue. He's a pretty good General Zod. Um, they actually tie General Zod in with the city of Kandor, which is in Smallville. It's not a frozen city. It's actually a military unit commanded by General Zod that are the only other survivors. Well, in Smallville, there's a lot of survivors from Krypton, but they survived in mass, and all together, these soldiers come to Earth, and they're led by this madman General Zod, who, as usual, wants to recreate Earth in Krypton's image, and Clark has to stop him. Callum Blue's a pretty good General Zod. He's actually a great General Zod, but he's not going to be as iconic as the other two. So we move on to Terrence Stamp. Terrence Stamp is, of course, the classic General Zod that we all grew up with, and he's the one that has the wonderful Neil was for Zod line. And I do like Terrence Stamp, but for me, Michael Shannon in Man of Steel is the best General Zod. He's the General Zod that he's the true soldier. He's committed to bringing about the new Krypton no matter what it takes. I liked the level of energy that he brought to it. He's not going to be as iconic as, say, the Joker in the Batman films. He's not going to be that iconic. But comparing one Zod to the next, I do think he was the best. And so that will be my take on Krypton in the Superman legend.